The subject of this presentation is neural graph reasoning, complex logical query answering meets graph databases. Interestingly enough, in March 2023, an article was published with this exact name. It's a detailed, if not authoritative, coverage of the research to date, and it also proposes neural graph databases as an objective. The authors of the paper continue to publish, and interestingly enough, this particular article was republished in 2024 in November, called Neural Graph Reasoning, a Survey of Complex Query Answering. To really understand the subject, you have to look at a number of areas: graph neural networks, graph databases and vector stores, complex logical queries and answers, reasoning against graphs, neural graph databases, and natural language and large language models. Let's talk a little bit about databases. Why do we want databases? Well, they reduce the memory pressure in that you can store data on disk. They provide persistence. They also separate the data from the program so it can be shared. And they're transactional, and we're all familiar with the acronym ACID, atomic, consistent, isolated, and durable. So why graph databases? Well, graph databases add an understanding of graphs themselves, both structurally and query-wise. Vector stores are useful because they understand embedding and they understand distances without necessarily understanding graphs. So why neural graph databases? Well, according to the author, we want to include graph reasoning within the processing of the query, and we want complex query answering capability. We'll talk a little bit about that. A little spoiler alert, and this is a quote from Macy Besta. Graph databases, despite being an important part of graph analytics landscape, have still not embraced the full predictive capabilities of graph neural networks. So far, neural graph databases are a goal, not a product. The first topic we want to look at when we get into the paper is what query answering means. And it's essentially a set of mappings that match query constraints and return values. And it would typically look something like this, where we have the name, the birth date, and the education. It's possible to search over an index and check for matches based on a logical expression, but to make the matching more efficient and certainly more flexible, you want to reduce the amount of information present and do a different type of comparison. And embedding and graph neural networks suit that bill. Logical queries involve a number of components, including existential, projection, union, conjunction, and negation. For some reason, I don't have disjunction on here, but unions qualifies there. There are a number of dialects for doing this. We're all familiar with SQL, where we do a select, which creates a projection, and we have where clauses. There are two other dialects that you should be familiar with. One is SparkQL, which, as you can see, begins to look a little more like a logical expression, and Cipher, which is used in Neo for J, it's got some complexities, but again, it's intended to work specifically on graphs. There are models for query answering that essentially can be classified as subsets of first order logic. There are also regular path queries, and it turns out that SparkQL and Cipher both can handle those expressions. They don't handle all graph queries, but we won't get into too much detail. In terms of query patterns, the most common is a path query, where we're going to do multi-hop queries that associate nodes through relations. There are also variations for trees, for directed acyclic graphs, and for cyclic graphs as well. Each one gets more complicated, and you'll find that many of the implementations reviewed are limited to the simplest cases. The author proposes a neural graph database. This database essentially has two components, a neural query engine and a neural graph store. The query engine is responsible for creating a plan and for executing it against an embedded store. And you notice on the right-hand side that there's an embedding of the query itself and then retrieval from the database, again, like a vector store based on distance between two embeddings. However, to get there, the database storage itself creates embeddings for the graph store and the features, and through encoding, creates that embedding store. There are alternatives that have been proposed for working with traditional graph databases. Our author of neural graph databases, Besta, talks about LPG to VEC, which is a different description. LPG is a different description of graphs that's used in this case to create embeddings. And you'll see, as you can see at the bottom of the diagram, he's using by-torch geometric to do the processing. A similar approach is suggested by Dmytro Lupashansky and Boran Shi, where they, in fact, use Cypher to do the neighborhood collection, to do the convolution, if you will, and they can move this data into memory from the database. Again, they're relying on Neo4j to do the storage and to hold the bulk of the data while bringing only enough into memory to process. I found this project very compelling. It is actually available on GitHub, but the implementation was somewhat difficult to configure considering they have you overlay parts of, or at least one file in Torch Geometric. And I found a number of bugs in the code that probably are related to newer versions of PyTorch and PyTorch Geometric. Interestingly enough, too, Mikhail Galkin has published another article in October of 2024 where he suggests using a foundation model with zero-shot logical query reasoning. So this project is called Ultra. I did take a look at it. It's not something that fit into the code that I was working on. So if you're interested in inductive processing, which he talks a lot about, I recommend you look at it. For the code in this project, I kept it very simple. We have a very limited graph here, and it's more for understanding the process than verifying the data in any particular technology right now. Here's a plot of that data. The first step was to understand how to store a graph in Neo4j from Network X, and these are the Cypher queries that I ended up creating to actually store and then reload data from Neo4j. And you will see that if you run the code, it will produce the same graph in memory from the database that you had before. Second part that we look at is embeddings. I've experimented here with Word2Vec and Node2Vec. This is the code. The Word2Vec is a little more involved because you have to do a random walk and use the walk to then create the embedding. And then we use Word2Vec to actually generate the embedding for each node and then roll up the node embeddings as a graph embedding by simply taking the average. And here are the values that we get. I only asked for 5 dimensions, so it would actually fit on the screen. So we have the node embeddings and the graph embedding. And then with Node2Vec, again, we load we create an instance of the class. We call the fit function. This is much simpler. We don't have to do the random walk. It will do it for us. And again, we get the node embeddings, and the graph embedding is the average of the nodes. And here are the embeddings for Node2Vec. In part 3, we experiment with natural language query using the BERT tokenizer and using the BERT model to encode a pre-trained base model. This is based on an approach called QAGNN that will take the query itself and embed it, and then we'll do reasoning using convolution and produce a probability score that the query is correctly answering the query. The example that I base this on, and I don't have it in the references, I apologize, is very simple, and I think it could be augmented. The query model, again, uses BERT. It tokenizes and embeds the query itself, and then it has one or more GCN conv layers, and then a linear output layer. The forward function, as you can see, will do the embedding of the query and concatenate the embedding with the feature vector, and then feed that to one or more GNN layers. Interestingly enough, with training 100 epochs on a specific question, we end up seeing some improvement with fewer layers. As we get up to 4 layers, adding more dimensions doesn't help. With smaller networks, adding dimensions did help. Overall, I think the model would benefit from embedding the labels as part of the graph edges, converting the output of the classifier to softmax, and using that as a test of ground truth, and generating a number of questions. This particular example only uses the question, what is an apple, or what color is an apple? And as a result, there's really not a lot of explainability, and I think that would be improved by doing better use of features. In general observations, using transformers and language models seems to show promise. I've also seen it used to generate the other embeddings. It's especially important, I think, to have explanations, to know, particularly with a graph structure where you may have missing links, but you do know the structure, that you should be able to explain why a particular query produced a specific result. Certainly handling disjunctions and negations and logical expressions. And in the near term, I think some clever queries can serve to reduce valid answers for supported logical expressions in graph databases. Oh, I should say the use of natural language can also help to go from natural language to specific SPARQL or Cipher queries, which would help verify the actual query that's being executed. Looking forward, I would recommend that if you're interested, follow the authors that I've listed here, particularly Mikhail Galkin and Macy Besta and Jure Leskovec, who teaches a course at Stanford specifically on graphs, and this is the whole idea of using neural networks and graph databases is something he pushes. Lots of papers being published, and I think whether existing graph databases are augmented or replaced or just give way to large language models is still a question. The full list of references is too long for these slides, but is on the attached article.